Hi everyone, good morning. I am Miss Angel May Solivio. So, for today, I will be discussing the chapter 21, which is the height of imperialism during 1800s to 1914. So, the coverage of this topic, or my topic rather, is the section 1 and section 2, which is the section 1 is all about colonial rule in Southeast Asia, and the section 2 is empire building in Africa. So let's start with the section 1, which is the colonial rule in Southeast Asia. So the main idea of this section is the um, under the new imperialism, European countries began to seek additional territory. So the new imperialism, so in the 19th century, a new phase of Western expansion began. It is in European nations that to view the Asian and African societies as a source of industrial and raw materials and a market for Western manufactured goods. So in the scramble for territories during the 1880s, European states began an intense scramble for overseas territory. So imperialism, for those who didn't know, it is all about the extension of a nation's power over the lands. So the imperialism is not new to the European states. So Europeans set up a colonies and trading posts in North Africa, South America, and Africa by the 16th century. However, the imperialism during the late 19th century, or which they called as the new imperialism, was different than the earlier European states, which is the Africa and Asia, in which they set up few trading posts where they could carry the trade and perhaps some missionary activities. So the motives of imperialism is lead to the question, which is the why did Westerners begin to increase their search for colonies after 1880? So it is because of so this is because of the strong economic motive, which the capitalist states in the West were looking for both markets and raw materials such as rubber, oil, and tin for their industries. So the issue was not simply an economic, but however, European nation states were involved in heated rivalries. So they acquired colonies abroad in order to gain more power or more advantage over their rivals. So the colonies were also a source of national prestige, and to some people, in fact, a nation could not be a great without colonies. So in addition to the imperialism, so imperialism was tied to the social Darwinism and racism, which is the social Darwinist belief that in the struggle between nations, the fit are victorious. And the racism, on the other hand, is the belief that race determines traits and capabilities. And also racists enormously believe that particular races are superior or inferior. Racist belief have led to the use of military forces against other nations. So one of the British professor have argued during the 1900s, as he stated that the path of progress is strewn with the wrecks of nations. Traces are everywhere to be seen of the slaughtered remains of inferior races. Yet, these dead people are in very truth the stepping stone on which mankind has arisen to the higher intellectual and deeper emotional life of today. So, some Europeans took a more religious and humanitarian approach to the imperialism because they believe that Europeans had moral responsibility to civilize primitive people, which um, which they call this responsibility as the white man's burden. So, to some people, this meant bringing the Christian message to the Hethian masses, and to others, it meant bringing the benefits of Western democracy and the colonial takeover. So, the new imperialism of the late 19th century was evident in Southeast Asia. In fact, during 1800s, the Europeans ruled only two societies in this area, which is the Spanish Philippines and the Dutch East Indias. And by 1900s, virtually the entire area was under the Western rule. And the Great Britain began the process. So in 1819, the Great Britain sent Sir Thomas Stanford Raffles to found a new colony on a small island at the tip of Malay Peninsula, which is called as now a Singapore, or the City of the Lion. So Singapore became a major stopping point for the traffic or going to or from China. Raffles was proud to his new city. In fact, he wrote about Singapore to a friend in England, which he stated that here all is life and activity, and it would be difficult to name a place on the face of the globe with brighter prospects. So during a few decades, the British advanced in the Southeast Asia and continued. So the next kingdom to fall is the Burma, or which is now Myanmar. So Britain wanted control of Burma in order to protect its possessions in India, and it also sought a land route through Burma into South China. So, although the difficult terrain along the frontier between Burma and China caused this effort to fail, so British activities in Burma led to the collapse of the Burmese monarchy. So in France, in which they had some missionaries operating in Vietnam, so they nervously watched the British advance into Burma, in which the local Vietnamese authorities, who viewed Christianity as a threat to Confucian doctrine, persecuted the French missionaries. However, the Vietnam failed to stop the Christian missionaries. So the Vietnamese internal rivalries divided the countries into two separate governments, which is in the north and the south. So the France was especially alarmed by British attempts to monopolize the trade. So to stop any British movement into Vietnam, the French government decided during the 1857 to force the Vietnamese to accept French protection. So the French eventually succeeded in making the Vietnamese ruler give up territories in the Mekong River Delta. So French occupied the city of Saigon, and during the next 30 years, they extended their control over the rest of the country. And by 1884, France seized the city of Hanoi and later made the Vietnamese Empire a French protectorate, or a protectorate is a political unit that depends on another government for its protection. So, by 1880s, France extended again its control over neighboring country, which is the Cambodia, Annam, Tonkin, and Laos. And by the 1887, France included all of its new possession in a new Union of French in Indochina. So, after the French conquest of Indochina, Thailand, or the Siam, was the only remaining state in the Southeast Asia. So during the last quarter of the 19th century, British and French rivalry threatened to place Thailand uh, to under the control of colonial rule. So there were two remarkable rulers who opposed this French rivalry. So this was King Mongkut, or known as theater goers as the King in The King and I, and the King Chulalongkorn. So these kings both promoted Western learning and maintained friendly relations with the major European powers. And during the 1896, Britain and France agreed to maintain Thailand as an independent mm, state between their possessions in Southeast Asia. And in the United States, which is the final conquest in Southeast Asia during the end of the 19th century, President William McKinley, in other hand, decided to return to the Philippines, which had been under Spanish control, and became an American colony. So this action of President McKinley also prevent the area from falling into the hands of the Japanese. So the mixture of moral idealism and desire for profit was reflected in a speech given in the U.S. Senate in January 1900s by Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana. So as he stated, Mr. President, the times call for candor. The Philippines are ours forever, and just beyond the Philippines are China's unlimited markets. We will not retreat from either. We will not abandon an opportunity in Asia. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race, trustee, under God of the civilization of the world. So, Filipinos did not agree with the speech of American Senador. Colonial regimes. So Western powers governed their new colonial empires by either indirect or direct power. So the chief goal of this is to exploit the natural resources of the land and to open more markets for their manufactured goods. So indirect and direct rule. So one example of this indirect rule is the Dutch of the East India Company, in which he used a indirect rule in the Dutch East Indies. So under the indirect rule, the local rulers were allowed to keep their authority and status in a new colonial setting. So this kind of rule made an access to the region's natural resources much easier. So indirect rule was also cheaper because fewer officials had to be trained, and it affected local culture less. However, the indirect rule was not always possible. So some local elites resisted the foreign conquest. So in these cases, the local elites were replaced with British officials, in which this kind of rule is called a direct rule. So one example of this is that during the Great Britain, that they administered the Burma directly through its colonial government in India. So in Indochina or in France, um, they use both systems, which is the direct and indirect rule, that imposed direct rule in southern Vietnam but ruled indirect through the emperor in northern Vietnam. So to justify their conquest in Western powers, so they spoke of bringing the blessings of Western civilization to their colonial subjects, including representative government. But however, many Westerners came to fear the idea of native peoples, especially those educated ones, being allowed political rights. Colonial economies. So the colonial powers did not want their colonies to develop their own industries. So the colonial policy stressed the export of raw materials. So the colonial policy often led to some form of plantation agriculture, in which peasants worked as wage laborers on the foreign-owned plantations, and the plantation owners kept the wages at poverty levels to increase profits. So, colonial rule did bring some benefits to Southeast Asia. So, this is where a modern economic system began. So, colonial governments built railroads, highways, and other structures that benefited native peoples as well as colonials. So, they developed an export market which helped create an entrepreneurial class in rural areas. And in the Dutch East Indians, for example, small growers of rubber, palm oil, coffee, tea, and spices began to share in the profits of the colonial enterprises. So most of these profits were taken back to the colonial mother country. So the resistance to colonial rule. Many people in Southeast Asia resented being governed by Western people. So at first, resistance came from the existing ruling class. So in Burma, for example, the monarch himself fought Western domination. By contrast, in Vietnam, after the emperor had agreed to French control of his country, a number of government officials set up an organization called Convogue, which is Save the King. So they fought against the French without the emperor's help. So the resistance to Western control took the form of peasant revolts. So under the colonial rule, peasants were often driven off the land to make a way for plantation agriculture. So the agri-peasants then vented their anger at the foreign invaders. So, for example, in Burma during the 1930s, the Buddhist monk Sayasan led a peasant uprising against the British colonial regime, and many years after the regime had completed its takeover. So, the early resistance movements failed. They overcome by Western powers. So, at the beginning of the 12th century, a new kind of resistance began. So, that was based on the force of nationalism. So, the leaders were often from a new class that the colonial rule had created, or the westernized intellectuals in the cities. And the new urban middle class is composed of the merchants, clerks, students, and professionals. So these people is educated in Western style schools. So there were the first generation of Asians to embrace the institutions and values of the West. So many of them spoke Western language and worked in jobs connected with colonial regimes. At first of it, many of the leaders of these movements did not focus clearly on the idea of nationhood. Instead, they simply tried to defend the economic interests or religious belief of the native peoples. So, example of this is that in Burma, students at the University of Rangoon formed an organization to protest against official persecution of the Buddhist religion and British lack of respect for local religious tradition. So they protested against British arrogance and failure to observe local custom in Buddhist temples. So not until during 1930s, these resistance movements, as those began in Burma, began to demand um, national independence.